Welcome back, folks, to another edition of WrestleRant, where I give my in-depth analysis of all the pay-per-views that I watch on the WWE Network. In this edition, I'll be talking about the 2013 installment of Night of Champions. Definitely not one of the better installments of the event, but nevertheless, let's get right down to it. Kicking off the show, not talking about the pre-show here, but kicking off the actual show is Triple H of the Authority, basically talking about how in the main event later on tonight, there will be no interference between Daniel Bryan and Randy Orton in the WWE Championship match. Out comes Paul Heyman with Curtis Axel in tow, talking about how he should not be going into battle with CM Punk later on that evening, call off the matchup, all that kind of stuff. Triple H says no, obviously given his history with Paul Heyman, and Triple H kind of came off as a babyface here. So, I mean, around this point in time, Triple H was yet to go full-fledged heel. Technically, he did at SummerSlam when he turned on Daniel Bryan, but still around this period in time, he was still kind of wavering the babyface heel line. So it was really kind of hard to boo him or go 100% heel or babyface. It was really weird. But anyway, given his history with Paul Heyman, this kind of made sense. Also, Curtis Axel spoke up, said, "You shouldn't talk to Paul Heyman that way. What do you think you're doing?" Triple H did not appreciate the back talk and instead put Curtis Axel in an Intercontinental Championship matchup. Now, Night of Champions, you would think, as with this year's card, and this is something I was very happy to see done this year that wasn't done last year, in that Night of Champions, the entire purpose of the event, dating back to the inaugural event in 2008, or even the 2007 show in Night of Champions, the Vengeance Edition, that every championship must be defended. That's always been the tagline. That was the reason why the event was created in the first place, which you drive in, create a bigger buy rate because people knew that it was going to be a big event. Every title would be on the line, which is something you don't normally see on every other pay-per-view, maybe except for WrestleMania or SummerSlam or whatever. Was not the case with every ordinary pay-per-view in WWE. That's why Night of Champions was special. They did not drive home that fact at all going into the show, and therefore Curtis Axel, despite being in a mid-feud with, he was kind of in a temporary feud with Kofi Kingston over the Intercontinental Championship, despite Kofi Kingston beating him on a number of occasions to earn a shot at that IC title match. They didn't announce the match beforehand. And I'm not saying that had they announced this IC title match beforehand between Curtis Axel and Kofi Kingston, it would have increased the buy rate, but that was always a very dumb strategy to me, to wait until the very last minute, not even until the last minute, wait until the pay-per-view itself to announce a title match for a show called Night of Champions. That made absolutely no sense, but even still, the opening match of Curtis Axel versus Kofi Kingston with the IC title on the line. They worked a good matchup, and Curtis Axel is a great wrestler, but this still rings true to this day. The guy just has no personality. He's just not very entertaining. That's why Paul Heyman was a flop as a manager, and I don't really put the blame on nor Axel or Heyman. It's just the fact that it wasn't going to work. People looked at Curtis Axel, a.k.a. Michael McGillicuddy, as an enhancement talent for so long that it was really kind of hard to rid the stench of him, from him as a job guy. And although he was the IC champion, he was made to be the fall guy during the feud with CM Punk. So that alone kind of ruined his momentum or credibility as Intercontinental Champion. But nevertheless, a great wrestler, had a very good match with Kofi Kingston here, and still the IC champion with a successful, clean victory over the Gone and Superstar. So, that being said, Curtis Axel still your Intercontinental Champion here. Up next, we have the Divas Championship up for grabs with AJ Lee defending against Natalya, Brie Bella, and Naomi, in which was a Total Divas Fatal 4-Way. Now, this matchup came about after AJ Lee cut her pipe bombshell on an episode of Raw in August of that year, talking about how Total Divas was a joke, reality TV is a joke, that she's the best women's wrestler in the world. Great pipe bomb. Even AJ herself has said in an interview since that WWE really dropped the ball with that storyline, with that angle. It was one of the most talked about Divas angles in quite some time, and they really didn't follow up that momentum properly in subsequent weeks. AJ, like I just said, AJ herself has said that in past interviews, and I definitely agree with that. I think had they really run with that as opposed to the Total Divas versus True Divas, Total Divas storyline that they ended up doing in the final few months of 2013, and run with that pipe bombshell storyline instead, it would have made for a few more intriguing months of the Divas division instead of these pointless matches. And maybe the matches still would have been pointless, but at least we would have had a more intriguing storyline, because this storyline was really, it was predictable, it was dumb. I mean, I'm an avid viewer of Total Divas, I admit that, but even I didn't enjoy this bullshit they were doing on TV at the time. But this is kind of Brie Bella's pseudo face turn, not really official, and that's what people really didn't like about the face turn of Brie Bella, was that it was never really made official. She was just kind of sided with the face divas in Natalya and Naomi. So technically it was a 3-on-1 match with the Total Divas against AJ Lee, and that was kind of the storyline going into this matchup, that she was trying to overcome the odds. So that kind of made it predictable that AJ Lee was coming out victorious, and she did, thankfully, to continue on the longest reigning Divas Championship reign in WWE history. But the match itself I thought was fine for what it was. I thought it was underrated in that there were a few cool spots. It was sloppy at some points, sure, but for the most part I thought it was a good matchup, good work from all four women. Just the storyline support wasn't really there. I mean, they tried, I'll give them that. It's just the fact that no one really cared about the Total Divas versus True Divas bullshit that they force-fed us for those final few months of 2013 and going into 2014 a little bit too, but they try to sway away from that when they try to make Naomi the number one contender to the Divas title. So that was absolute bullshit. But up next, though, we had the World Heavyweight Championship on the line with Rob Van Dam contending for the title against the then-champion Alberto Del Rio. A very well-wrestled matchup between these two. The matches were always very, very good. They had a great series of matches during this period of time. But again, the storyline support wasn't really there. RVD pinned Del Rio in an episode of Raw randomly to get a world title shot, which makes sense. Granted, he should have won a number one contenders match, but even still, that kind of triggered the feud between Del Rio and RVD. But the worst part about this feud between RVD and Del Rio was the fact that Ricardo, we were supposed to believe was Ricardo Rodriguez, was supposed to be the wingman for RVD, was supposed to be the mouthpiece like Bill Alfonso was back in ECW, whistle and all. It was really, really stupid. Ricardo and RVD, to this day, I cannot figure out for the life of me why those two were put together. And I know Ricardo was feuding with Del Rio at the time after Del Rio had turned on Ricardo on an episode of Raw in August. I understand that. But the relationship, the partnership of RVD and Ricardo made absolutely no sense to anybody because they had zero chemistry. RVD is not the best mic worker, and maybe Ricardo was brought into... They probably thought that he could talk for him, but that wasn't really the case at all. He didn't talk, he didn't do any promos, he just kind of stood in his corner. It was really, really stupid. It really dragged down this feud, which otherwise could have been good. But like I said before, the matches were good. This matchup was no exception. It went almost about 20 minutes, maybe a little longer than it should have, considering it wasn't a great matchup, just a very good contest. And also considering the finish that Del Rio got himself disqualified, still the World Heavyweight Champion. RVD wins via disqualification, but even still, though, it continued the feud. I guess that it was a weak way of doing it, and also after the matchup, RVD took out Del Rio with the trash can, so that kind of set up their Battleground no DQ match at Battleground a couple weeks later. That train wreck of a show, which I hopefully will never have to review on this channel. But even still, though, I digress. A good matchup from RVD and Del Rio. Kind of a weak finish to continue the feud of Del Rio and RVD. I understand where the booking decision came from, but it was lazy booking to continue the feud between the two, especially after a very good match. After 20 minutes of very good in-ring action, we are subjected to that bullshit finish. So again, another dumb finish in a row from WWE on this show. But anyway, Del Rio still the World Heavyweight Champion. Up next, we had The Miz versus Fandango in a very filler matchup. It was announced at the last minute. Had very little storyline support behind it. The two had first triggered off their feud at SummerSlam about a month earlier. The Miz was the host of SummerSlam on that show. Fandango, if you can recall correctly, I talked about it here on the when I reviewed SummerSlam last month, when Fandango came out dancing, all that kind of stuff. So that happened. That kind of set the stage for this matchup on the show. Despite the fact Miz had already beat Fandango on Raw a couple of weeks earlier, this matchup was really no different. The matchup wasn't horrendous. It wasn't any terrible sports entertainment or anything bullshitty like that. It was a fine wrestling matchup, but like I said before, no one cared about either guy at this period in time, which really hurts me to say because I'm a big Miz fan, I'm a big Miz fan, but no one cared about The Miz as a babyface. They horribly botched his face turn, and I still to this day think he had potential to be a strong babyface. WWE just absolutely butchered that completely. And then Fandango had lost all of his momentum by this point after beating Jericho at WrestleMania that year, at WrestleMania 29. So this matchup was fine for what it was. It was a fine filler matchup. Miz goes over via submission. Just no one really cared. It was just kind of there to kill time. And especially after a flat first hour of the show, no one really cared to see these two go at it. So up next, we had the handicap no disqualification match with Paul Heyman and Curtis Axel taking on CM Punk. Now, of course, this was another chapter in the what I thought was a great feud, a great storyline angle between CM Punk and Paul Heyman for the latter half of 2013. I thought it was very well done. Maybe up until the end, it kind of died a very slow death in how it was booked and the inclusion of Ryback, which I'll get to in a second. But for the most part, I thought it was a pretty good feud between Heyman and Punk, especially given their promo work and all that kind of stuff. They were great both on the mic, so they had awesome chemistry together. The match itself really wasn't anything of note. I mean, Curtis Axel, like I said before, was the fall guy for Paul Heyman, took the losses to CM Punk every single week going into this show, that he really served no threat. He really wasn't much of a threat to CM Punk on this show because he'd already been beaten by him so many times before. And the storyline going into the show was that Paul Heyman wasn't really confident in Curtis Axel's ability to defeat CM Punk, so therefore he brought him back up in the form of Ryback, and I'll get to that in 1 second. But Curtis Axel taken out with ease by CM Punk. Really no surprise there. People were anxious to see CM Punk get his hands on Paul Heyman, which he did, and that was good for what it was. And the beating that he laid on Paul Heyman was vicious, and I believe Paul Heyman had something like a cushioning or something underneath the jacket or the vest that he was wearing that night. The beating that he put on him was so brutal, though, that it really kind of took away from the beating that he put on Paul Heyman a couple of months later at Hell in a Cell, which I'll also review here on the channel at some point in time within the next month. But the whole point of that feud was for CM Punk to finally get his hands on Paul Heyman. And because he did that on this show, there was really no point in this feud continuing. Technically, it kind of transitioned into Ryback and Punk after this, and not really Punk and Heyman, because he'd already gotten his due. Heyman had basically gotten his due on this show, and getting beat the hell out of at the hands of CM Punk. So, although the beating was brutal, it was a sight to see for sure, it dragged out too long to the point that there was really no point in the feud continuing past this show, so that really made no sense. So, like I said before, out comes Ryback to make the save, helps Heyman pick up the victory, a big bragging rights win for Paul Heyman in being able to defeat the self-proclaimed best wrestler in the world, so he took that tagline, and therefore the feud continued. I thought it was a good idea. I popped this, probably the only thing I popped for on this show, because Ryback was doing nothing at this point in time. They killed his heel turn, they killed his heel run after he was involved in a feud with John Cena, and I think earlier 2013, right after WrestleMania, that he was doing nothing. He was involved in backstage segments, he was involved in catering, in the showers, God forbid, all those stupid segments. So this was kind of a breath of fresh air for Ryback, and the bully character that, I mean, it was perfect. I mean, the fact that he was saying that Paul Heyman was bullying CM Punk, and that he was bullying CM Punk, and all that kind of stuff. That Punk was bullying Paul Heyman, and instead Ryback was going to be the one to bully CM Punk. It was great. I thought it was awesome storytelling. But that feud also died a death at Battleground with a mediocre matchup between Punk and Ryback, and no one really cared to see the feud continue past that point. But at the time, I thought it was a great idea to include Ryback, but he never really came out of this any better than he was going into it. I mean, where is he today? He's not doing. I mean, currently he's out on the sidelines, but his partnership with Paul Heyman as well didn't really benefit his status or in the company whatsoever. But even so, though, that was that. Up next for the United States Championship, Dean Ambrose defending the gold against Dolph Ziggler. A good matchup here. A lot of people were expecting a blockbuster bout. They got about 15 minutes, which is a lot of time for a mid-card U.S. title match, so I commend them for giving them time. Just, again, it really didn't have any storyline support. They had faced off a few times on TV before this. They were good matches. They just weren't as good as a lot of people expected them to be, and I also thought this was much of the same. It wasn't the blockbuster bout that everyone expected it to be. It was a great match down the line in the final few minutes, but as a whole, it was really underwhelming. It wasn't a great matchup or as good of a matchup as it could have been. Dean Ambrose came out victorious, still the United States champion, and Dolph Ziggler was still a hot commodity of sorts at this period of time after beating Big E and AJ at SummerSlam. But past that point, they had really failed to capitalize on his momentum in the whole U.S. title at this period of time. I mean, Dean Ambrose wasn't really defending it much. So it was kind of a match, I mean, that really relied on the in-ring action alone. And because the in-ring action didn't deliver as strongly as some people had thought it would, I mean, it was a good matchup. It just didn't meet those expectations, like right up here where people had set for it, that it really wasn't a must-see matchup, I guess I should say. I mean, they had another matchup the next night on Raw, which was a very good contest. But for the most part, it really wasn't as great as a lot of people thought it would, so it was a bit of a disappointment. But that led right into the next matchup for the WWE Tag Team titles between the Shield and the Primetime Players, with the Tag Team titles on the line. So this was set up after the kickoff match earlier on in the night, when the Primetime Players to beat Tons of Funk, the Usos, 3MB, and the Real Americans to become the new number one contenders to the twin titles. The Primetime Players were riding a wave of momentum at the time, after Darren Young came out as gay, I think right after SummerSlam, so they got some positive mainstream media from that. They tried to build off that, not as much as they probably could have, but they had just turned babyface. They got some support, storyline support for the most part, not acknowledging that he was gay or anything, but they got a few wins here and there. They turned babyface. They were over, so they were a logical team to be set up as the number one contenders to the tag team titles. A good matchup, went about 7 minutes. I mean, there was really nothing noteworthy about this matchup as well, kind of continuing the theme of underwhelming matches on the show. Not really the Shield's fault, not really the primetime players' fault. It's not even that they didn't lack or didn't have any chemistry together. It was just kind of more so the fact that the primetime players, they had gotten a few wins here and there over the Real Americans going into the show, but aside from that, they weren't really positioned as threats to the tag team titles. The Shield was still going strong. It was a match that people pretty much just sat on their hands for in the audience during the course of this contest, which is a shame because I think it could have been a very good matchup had it had some storyline support behind it, but because it was rushed, it was announced at the last minute, it didn't get a lot of time. It only got about 7 minutes, which is probably the amount of time it probably should have gotten. But all those factors, you put all those together, it's really not surprising that the crowd was not involved in this matchup as they probably could have been. So the primetime players come up short of winning the tag team titles. Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins still your tag team champions. So that leads us right into the main event between Daniel Bryan and Randy Orton for the WWE title, with Randy Orton bringing in the title. He was the champion going into the show. Daniel Bryan was invoking his rematch clause. This was another feud that had storyline support behind it, but the feud between Orton and Daniel Bryan was so freaking botched right after SummerSlam last year that it really hindered this matchup, and that Randy Orton, until the last week of television, had gotten the better of Daniel Bryan at every single turn on Raw and SmackDown. It was, I think, 7 or 8 times, if you combine Raw and SmackDown, that Orton and the Authority had gotten the better of Daniel Bryan. And Orton was supposed to go over on this show. And had Orton gone over on the show, it would have made Daniel Bryan out to be a loser. So he couldn't have lost here. But also on that same token, it was far too soon for Daniel Bryan to be winning back the WWE title. I love the fact they waited until WrestleMania to finally give him the title. That wasn't really made clear at this time. At this point in time, I thought they were going to wait until Hell in a Cell. But 1 month after losing that title, it was far too soon for him to be regaining it. So instead of being extremely excited about Daniel Bryan winning back the championship on this show, if anything, I was disappointed because I thought it was far too soon in the story for him to be winning back the gold. And it wasn't until the next night that Triple H had announced, because of the quick count from referee Scott Armstrong, that Daniel Bryan would be stripped of the title, leading into the whole Bayan bullshit and all that kind of garbage. But even so, though, the match itself I thought was good. But again, much like Dean Ambrose and Dolph Ziggler, the people, the fans, and myself included, the fans had set a very high standard for this contest, and pretty much the entire series of matches between Daniel Bryan and Randy Orton in the fall of 2013, but none of them were really at that level. This was a matchup that they kind of held back for most of it. The final few minutes were fun, but for the most part, it felt underwhelming. Their Battleground match was the same way. Their Hell in a Cell match was a bit better than both of those bouts. But that also was not a great matchup. So, I mean, the series of matches between Daniel Bryan and Randy Orton as a whole was underwhelming. This was really no exception. And like I said before, it was a solid matchup, a good matchup, but the finish for me, I mean, it's weird saying that because Daniel Bryan went over clean technically, aside from the quick count from the referee. It was disappointing. I was not excited to see Daniel Bryan as WWE champion, if only because I knew he would be stripped of it the very next night. I know they wanted to create a hook for people to watch the show the next night, and God knows they needed it, given the fact that it was football season at the time when this happened, as is with every Night of Champions event. But even still, though, I think it was far too soon in the story for Daniel Bryan to be winning back the WWE title. So that alone kind of made this whole match show very underwhelming. And they needed a title change on the show, because every other match on the show had seen the champion retain their title. So we needed a new champion on this show, and it had to be Daniel Bryan. So it was really a lose-lose situation. And it was, of course, like I said before, led into the whole Bayan storyline, that whole garbage of a feud, and that whole angle, which I absolutely despise. Not a very fun fall for the WWE in 2013. I'm not saying this year is going to be much better based off what we've seen so far. But even so, though, it kind of continued the feud between Daniel Bryan and Randy Orton. Made Randy Orton look weak for dropping the title so quickly. Daniel Bryan getting stripped of it was just not a very well booked out angle. So that's it. That closed out the show of Night of Champions 2013. If I had to rank every Night of Champions event, this would probably be The very last one, because at least 2011 installment, which I was also not a fan of, if you saw my review of that show, cheap plug, check it out if you haven't already. But at least that show had a saving grace in the World Heavyweight Championship matchup between Mark Henry and Randy Orton. The matchup wasn't great, but the moment in the subsequent promo from Mark Henry becoming the World Heavyweight Champion were both freaking awesome. On the show, there wasn't really anything that was must-see at all. The IC title match, good, but forgettable. Divas title match, a good, well-wrestled matchup, but again, really nothing memorable. World Heavyweight title match, solid, weak finish. Miz and Fandango, filler match, what more can I say? Paul Heyman and Curtis Axel versus CM Punk. The matchup was really overshadowed by what happened with the beatdown and the Ryback thing, so the matchup itself was really of no consequence. Dean Ambrose and Dolph Ziggler did not meet expectations. The Shield versus Primetime Players, forgettable matchup. And the main event, same thing like Dean Ambrose and Dolph Ziggler, just did not meet expectations. It was not very well booked, considering the fact there could have been far better ways that could have gone about that, aside from Daniel Bryan winning the title so quickly in the story and kind of taking away from the moment that he would win back that title eventually. And it didn't. I mean, at WrestleMania, he still got a big pop, but I still wish they had not given back the title so quickly, even if it was for only 24 hours. So, like I said, as a whole, the show is very, very underwhelming. Definitely the flattest of all the Night of Champions shows. So, needless to say, I would not suggest that you go back and watch this show. But that's going to conclude my series, my series of reviews for the Night of Champions event dating back from 2007, including Vengeance, to the 2013 event. I had fun and not so fun watching some of these shows, this one included. But of all the Night of Champions events as a whole, we'll wrap it up here. 2010 installment, I thought it was great. 2008 was good as well. And the 09 was fine for what it was. So if anything, the three Night of Champions shows I would highly suggest you check out are 08, 2010, and 2012. I thought those were the top three. 2010 being the best, in my opinion, or at least my favorite. 2012 being the second best, and 08 being the third best. So don't go out of your way to watch this show, 2013, or any of the other events, in my opinion. So, also coming up here on the channel, I will be reviewing the pay-per-views. What's up, dude? The Hell in a Cell pay-per-views. Oh, come on in. Say out of the camera. I'm reviewing a pay-per-view here. This is my roommate, Connor. So coming up here on the channel, I'll be reviewing the Hell in a Cell pay-per-views for the WWE, the 09, 2010, 2011, 2012, and the 2013 installments as well. So that will be coming up within the next month here on the channel. Always appreciate the support. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll be back in a few days with my review of the 2009 installment of WWE Hell in a Cell. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys soon.